On a chilly March night in 1566, the imposing stone walls of Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh bore witness to one of the most savage political assassinations in Scotland's history. Within the Queen's private quarters, where candlelight danced across richly woven tapestries, a man met an unimaginably brutal end stabbed more than 50 times, while his royal protector looked on in horror. This account is not merely a chronicle of murder. It exposes the lethal convergence of envy, ambition, and the relentless hunger for power in Renaissance era Scotland. David Rizzio's legacy has endured not for his talents in diplomacy or music, but for the horrifying violence that marked his death. His killing stands as one of the most calculated and public acts of political brutality, committed in front of royalty and fueled by tensions that would soon redefine an entire nation. The blood that soaked the wooden floors of Holyrood that night became more than a stain. It was a lasting testament to how swiftly political favor could turn fatal. The narrative of Rizzio's assassination casts light on the fragile nature of power. In 16th century Scotland, a land where foreign influences were deeply mistrusted, and even the monarch's closest confidants faced constant peril. This was a time when disputes were resolved not through dialogue but through blades, and where closeness to authority often equated to exposure to lethal risk. To truly comprehend this murder, one must delve into the tangled web of loyalties, ambitions, and fears that rendered such an atrocity almost inevitable. What makes Rizzio's demise particularly chilling is not just its ferocity, but its deeply personal setting committed within the domestic intimacy of a royal chamber, in full view of a pregnant queen, powerless to prevent it. The emotional torment unleashed that night extended well beyond Rizzio himself. It sent a chilling warning to any who might threaten the prevailing order. This was not just an act of murder, it was political intimidation in its most intimate and deliberate form. Scotland, in the 1560s, was a country caught between external pressures and internal discord, fighting to preserve its sovereignty while maneuvering through the volatile currents of European diplomacy. Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had returned from France in 1561 to govern a realm she scarcely recognized, bringing with her the elegance of the French court and a Catholic devotion that clashed with the increasingly Protestant Scottish nobility. Her royal household attracted foreign diplomats, creatives, and opportunists eager to shape Scottish policy or reap the benefits of royal influence. To the native nobility, these foreign presences were viewed with intense suspicion and mounting hostility. Having defended their ancestral privileges for generations, they were unwilling to concede authority to outsiders, especially Catholic ones within a kingdom leaning more decisively toward Protestantism. The religious upheaval of the Reformation only compounded these hostilities, with noble factions aligning themselves along both confessional and political lines. Amidst such a volatile political climate, anyone believed to wield excessive sway over the young queen was seen as a threat that needed to be removed. Mary's 1565 marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was intended to reinforce her position by aligning her with a Protestant spouse who could garner favor in both English and Scottish circles. However, rather than stabilizing her rule, the union introduced new challenges. Darnley proved to be insecure, envious, and dangerously ambitious. Though his Tudor lineage gave him a legitimate claim to the English throne, making him a strategic political asset, erratic behavior and personal weaknesses made him a serious liability that would play a direct role in the ensuing bloodshed The already fragile political equilibrium was further strained by fierce competition among Scotland's powerful noble factions, each vying for dominance over royal affairs. The Protestant lords, spearheaded by leaders like the Earl of Moray, Mary's illegitimate brother, were especially wary of the Catholic presence at court. They regarded foreign advisors not only as rivals for the Queen's attention, but as possible agents of a Catholic resurgence that could endanger the religious and political reforms they had secured. David Rizzio arrived in Scotland around 1561, accompanying the envoy of Savoy, a modest, yet strategically placed duchy in modern-day northern Italy. Of modest beginnings, likely the son of a musician from near Turin, Rizzio brought with him sharp intellect, fluency in several languages, and most crucially, a gift for music that would open doors to Scotland's elite. At a time when musical performances were held in high regard at royal courts, his talents as both a vocalist and instrumentalist quickly earned him a place in Mary's inner circle. Starting his service as a bass singer in the Queen's small ensemble, Rizzio swiftly gained recognition for his cultured demeanor and keen social insight. Educated, multilingual, and imbued with a refined European grace, he was exactly the kind of courtier Mary, accustomed to the elegance of the French court, naturally gravitated toward, in contrast to many of her native nobles, whom she often found coarse and uncouth. Rizzio embodied the sophistication and finesse of the world she had once known. His ascent from court musician to trusted private secretary was nothing short of extraordinary, breaking norms within the Scottish royal household. Yet it was a testament to both his personal aptitude and Mary's deep need for confidants she could trust implicitly. By 1564, Rizzio had become her principal secretary for French correspondence, entrusted with delicate diplomatic exchanges, and gradually assuming greater administrative roles. His responsibilities gave him insight into sensitive matters of state and an increasing influence over the Queen's decisions, especially on issues of foreign affairs and religious governance. But Rizzio's role was not confined to bureaucracy. He became one of Mary's most intimate confidants, often engaged in long private discussions and accompanying her to discreet suppers and casual gatherings. The unusually close relationship between a foreign-born commoner and the Queen of Scots deeply unsettled the Scottish nobility, offering powerful ammunition to those determined to erode Mary's authority. Rizzio's living quarters within Holyrood Palace were situated in close proximity to the Queen's own, a spatial privilege that both symbolized his elevated role and aroused suspicion due to the potential for private, unsupervised access. The plot that would ultimately lead to David Rizzio's brutal death began to take shape during the winter of 1565-66, fueled by a volatile mix of political strategy and personal resentment. Lord Darnley, despite being the Queen's husband, felt increasingly sidelined in court affairs. He watched with growing bitterness as Mary entrusted Rizzio with the counsel and companionship he believed rightfully belonged to him. Darnley's insecurity was further inflamed by salacious gossip spreading through Edinburgh, rumors that cast doubt on his paternity of Mary's unborn child and hinted that Rizzio may have been the true father. Whether fabricated or believed, such rumors proved to be a perfect pretext for the Protestant lords to initiate their campaign against Rizzio, headed by the Earl of Morton and supported by prominent nobles like Lord Ruthven and the Earl of Lindsey. The conspirators began depicting Rizzio not only as a meddling foreigner, but as a dire threat to the legitimacy of the royal line and Scotland's autonomy. They branded him a papal agent working toward a Catholic resurgence, and accused him of seducing the Queen to advance his political ambitions. The plotters masterfully manipulated Darnley's jealousy and lust for influence, promising him that Rizzio's elimination would restore his rightful place at Mary's side as her chief counselor. They dangled before him a prize he desperately coveted, the crown matrimonial which would elevate him from royal consort to co-sovereign. Although this offer was almost certainly a ruse, it proved sufficient to gain his allegiance in what would become a deadly conspiracy. Heightening the tension, the religious dimension added another layer of justification for the coup. The Protestant lords argued that Rizzio's growing sway was steering Mary toward Catholic-friendly policies and potential foreign interference. They cited his role in diplomatic communications and his input on ecclesiastical appointments as proof of a broader Catholic agenda, threatening to unravel the Protestant gains in Scotland. With Parliament due to convene in March 1566 to deliberate on restoring estates to Catholic nobility, the conspirators felt a renewed urgency to act. On Saturday evening, the 9th of March, 1566, Holyrood Palace appeared calm. Queen Mary was hosting a quiet, informal dinner in her private quarters on the palace's second floor. The gathering was intentionally modestly David Rizzio, the Countess of Argyll, and her half-brother Robert Stewart joined her for an evening free from the rigid formality of court life. At 6 months pregnant, Mary increasingly preferred these smaller, more personal occasions to the ceremonial affairs typically required by royal protocol. Favoring these gatherings for their intimacy and ease, the Queen found her private quarters accessible via a narrow spiral staircase, both secluded and naturally defensible. The dining room, modest by regal standards, measured no more than 20 feet square and held a small table that could seat about 6 people comfortably. Stone walls adorned with tapestries of hunting scenes and a fire crackling in the hearth lent the room a warm, domestic, atmospheric environment. Mary increasingly cherished as her public life grew more fraught with political stress. Rizzio thrived in this setting, charming the guests with lively conversation and anecdotes, his charisma and sharp wit securing his usual place as the evening's focal point. Clad in his most elegant attirea, richly embroidered damask doublet, fine woolen hose, and a ceremonial dagger, he appeared every bit the favored courtier. Unbeknownst to him, his placement at the table back turned to the door that led into the Queen's bedchamber would prove tragically significant. As the meal wore on, the mood lightened. The group shifted to discussing poetry, music, and the latest court gossip. Mary seemed at ease, surrounded by trusted confidants and momentarily liberated from the rigid expectations of court protocol. No one in the room had any inkling of the danger creeping through the palace halls below, as the conspirators made their final preparations for a crime that would leave an indelible mark on Scottish history. Around 9 p.m., the muffled thump of heavy boots echoed ominously through Holyrood's corridors. The conspirators were nearing their target. First to arrive at the doorway between the Queen's bedroom and the dining room was Lord Darnley, assuming his role in the treacherous scheme. His unannounced entrance startled the diners but raised no immediate suspicion. As Mary's husband, he had every right to join the evening. Yet his agitated manner and the deliberate way he blocked Mary's access to the door should have alerted her to the trap being sprung. Mere moments later, additional footsteps sounded on the spiral stairs, each step amplifying the sense of menace. The first intruder to appear was Lord Ruthven, whose ghastly appearance, pallid face, and full suit of armor worn despite his ailing health cast, an eerie and paralyzing silence over the gathering. Behind him surged a cluster of armed men, their expressions grim and resolute as they forced their way into the small dining chamber. The Earl of Morton, Andrew Kerr of Fordenside, and Patrick Bellenden were among the armed conspirators who burst into the room, weapons drawn, and their deadly intentions unmistakable. The abrupt transformation of the Queen's quiet dinner into a tableau of impending violence was so jarring that for several moments, those present were too stunned to react. Rizzio, still seated with his back to the connecting door, found himself pinned between the table and a wall of steel. What had moments earlier been a position of comfort and status now became a trap from which there was no escape. Witnesses would later recall the look on his face, a haunting mixture of terror and stunned realization as he grasped that his worst fears were about to be fulfilled in the most brutal way imaginable. Lord Ruthven broke the silence with chilling clarity, pointing directly at Rizzio and declaring that the Italian must leave the Queen's presence immediately. When Mary demanded to know under whose authority they dared to violate her private quarters, Ruthven's response was stark. They had come for David Rizzio, and they would not leave without him. Sensing that death was imminent, Rizzio clutched at Mary's gown, imploring her to protect him, begging not to be surrendered. Despite her pregnancy and the overwhelming threat, the Queen stood her ground with striking bravery. She placed herself between Rizzio and the conspirators, invoking her royal authority and maternal condition as a barrier, insisting they honor her person and her chamber's sanctity. But the conspirators had already crossed the threshold, where commands and conscience held no sway. When Mary refused to hand Rizzio over, they turned to force. The tension snapped when Andrew Kerr of Fordenside raised a pistol and aimed it directly at Mary's abdomen, threatening to shoot if she continued to resist. This grotesque threat against both the Queen and her unborn heir shattered boundaries few had dared approach. Yet it served its intended purpose, paralyzing Mary momentarily with fear for her child. In that fleeting window of hesitation, the attackers struck. George Douglas, acting on behalf of Morton, plunged a dagger into Rizzio, reaching over Mary's shoulder to drive home the first blow with a weapon that belonged to Lord Darnley. The act not only delivered a fatal wound to the Italian secretary, but directly implicated Mary's husband in the bloody scheme. Rizzio's agonized scream reverberated through the chamber as the realization of his impending death set in. Blood began to spill instantly, soaking the Queen's garments and heralding the beginning of one of the most vicious political murders in Scottish history. What transpired was not a calculated execution, but an uncontrollable bloodbath that horrified even its orchestrators. Once the first dagger pierced Rizzio's body, the conspirators seemed to abandon any semblance of restraint, descending on him with a level of violence that far exceeded what was required to kill a defenseless man. They tore him from Mary's protection, dragging him across the chamber toward the bedroom door, all the while plunging daggers, swords, and any sharp implement into his body with relentless fury. Rizzio's frantic efforts to shield himself were utterly futile. Sheer terror fueled his resistance as he clawed at his assailants and flailed for weapons or escape paths that simply weren't there. His cries echoed through the intimate chambers, a haunting symphony of terror that spread through that wing of the palace. The ghastly sound of blades slicing flesh and bone, mingled with his pleas for mercy, composed a scene of horror that would linger in the minds of all who heard it. What unfolded was a descent into bloodlust. The conspirators no longer resembled political schemers, but savage executioners. Each seemed determined to take part in the carnage, as if their individual participation would dilute personal guilt. Eyewitnesses later recalled how some men continued to stab Rizzio even after he was lifeless, suggesting that hatred played as large a role as any political motive. Mary, restrained by several of the attackers, was helpless to intervene, and later described the horror as resembling something from the inferno itself. The cozy sanctuary of the dining chamber was transformed into a blood-soaked slaughterhouse. Rizzio's blood sprayed the walls, pooled on the wooden floor, and drenched the once beautiful tapestries. The coppery tang of blood blended with the acrid stench of fear and violence, creating a suffocating aura of death that clung to the room. When the frenzy finally subsided, Rizzio's body bore over 50 wounds each, a grim testament to the hatred and rage that drove his executioners. His corpse slumped in the doorway connecting the Queen's dining space to her bedroom, as though he had tried to crawl to safety, even as life ebbed away. The excessive number of wounds made it clear that nearly every conspirator had taken part in the killing, forging a collective culpability that bound them together in their crime. The immediate aftermath offered a disturbing glimpse into the character of the men involved. Instead of triumph or regret, many appeared shaken, staggered by the sheer savagery they had unleashed. The realization that they had murdered an unarmed man in front of their pregnant monarch began to set in as the fog of bloodlust lifted and sobering clarity returned. Mary's reaction to the brutal scene before her was a complex mix of anguish, fury, and chilling resolve emotions that would shape her dealings with the conspirators for the remainder of her rule. Though she had escaped physical harm, the psychological toll of witnessing the savage execution of a trusted confidant left lasting scars. The blood staining her gown served as a stark, visual symbol of her powerlessness in the face of aristocratic violence. More deeply, the threat to her unborn child underscored the fragile nature of her authority in a court teetering on political chaos. In the immediate aftermath, the conspirators made no effort to conceal their crime. Rizzio's body remained where he fell, and his blood continued to seep into the floorboards of the royal suite. Whether this was a calculated message or simply a result of shock and disarray, the scene was left untouched, transforming the room into a permanent crime scene. According to a persistent palace legend, the stains from Rizzio's blood could never be fully removed from the wood, becoming a lasting emblem of the capacity for political violence to erupt even in the most private spaces of royal life. The assassination of David Rizzio was not just a personal blow to the Queen, it was a bold affront to royal authority. Yet, in the wake of such trauma, Mary's position was too delicate to permit an immediate retaliation. Emboldened by their success in dispatching their target, the conspirators tightened their grip on power by effectively imprisoning the Queen within Holyrood Palace. They placed guards throughout the residence and regulated access to her rooms, reducing Mary to little more than a captive, while they tried to validate their actions through legislative channels. However, the plotters gravely misjudged Mary's political shrewdness. She identified Lord Darnley as the weakest link in their coalition and skillfully began to exploit his insecurities and self-interest. She planted doubts in his mind, suggesting that once the nobles had achieved their goals, they would discard him without hesitation. Darnley's naturally suspicious nature proved fertile ground for these suggestions, and within days, Mary had succeeded in driving a wedge between him and his fellow conspirators. On the 11th of March, past 2 days after the assassination, Queen made a daring escape that would become one of the most legendary in Scottish history. Disguised and accompanied only by Darnley and a few loyal attendants, she evaded the palace guards and fled to Dunbar Castle, There, she began rallying her supporters and preparing her retaliation. The swiftness with which she transformed from captive to fugitive to commanding monarch, again, highlighted the formidable political instincts that would guide her through the many trials of her reign. The collapse of the Rizzio conspiracy ultimately served to solidify Mary's grip on power. It cleared away some of her most dangerous adversaries and exposed just how deep the threats to her authority truly ran. Several leading conspirators were exiled, while others lost their estates and titles. Though the assassination had been orchestrated to undermine her reign, it instead highlighted her resilience and her capacity to weather even the most overt challenges. The blood spilled within her royal quarters became more than a memory of violent sight, evolved into a powerful symbol of her endurance in the face of overwhelming adversity. Over the centuries, Holyrood Palace became shrouded in tales of supernatural activity phenomena, many attributed to the brutal murder that occurred there in March 1566. The most enduring of these legends centers around the persistent bloodstains in the Queen's former apartments. According to staff accounts, no matter how often the floorboards were scrubbed, polished, or even replaced, dark blemishes would reappear precisely where Rizzio fell, as if the wooden planks retained an indelible imprint of that dreadful night. From the 17th through the 19th centuries, numerous visitors to the palace recounted eerie experiences in the murder chamber. These included mysterious sounds of struggle, sudden chills, and recurring stains that defied cleaning efforts. While many such claims can be traced to psychological suggestion or natural causes, the sheer consistency of these reports across generations suggests that the trauma of the murder left a psychological and perhaps atmospheric mark on the space. Rizzio's ghost story gradually intertwined with the wider legend of Mary, Queen of Scots, reinforcing the melancholic and dramatic image that would define her historical persona. Guides and writers began blending verified events with ghostly lore, crafting a narrative where documented tragedy met folklore. These spectral tales have helped preserve public memory of the assassination, ensuring that the dark consequences of Renaissance power struggles are not forgotten by those who walk Holyrood's halls. Modern restoration work has confirmed that the floorboards in Mary's old rooms do bear persistent mark zones that refuse to vanish despite countless treatments. Although these may be the result of aging wood or previous repairs, they align uncannily with historical records of where Rizzio was killed, whether explained by centuries of oxidation or something more mysterious. These stains remain a chilling link to one of Scotland's most harrowing acts of political violence. The assassination of David Rizzio endures as a chilling illustration of how unchecked ambition, sectarian hostility, and political desperation can ignite explosive acts of brutality. It also underscored the fragile standing of foreign advisors in a time marked by rising nationalism and religious division, revealing how swiftly cultural differences could be distorted into tools of political attack. Rizzio's fate became a cautionary tale for others seeking favor in foreign courts, illustrating how the proximity to power could carry grave risks alongside potential rewards. His brutal death also highlighted the unique vulnerabilities faced by female monarchs in a patriarchal political landscape. Mary's failure to protect her most trusted aide, despite her sovereign status, and evident bravery exposed the stark limitations of a queen's authority when confronted with coordinated violence by powerful men. The emotional torment inflicted on the expectant queen served a calculated purpose: to demonstrate that even royal women could be cowed and controlled through threats to their closest confidants. Viewed through a wider historical lens, Rizzio's assassination stands as an early example of xenophobic violence, the kind that would grow more prevalent as European nations cultivated stronger nationalist ideologies. The conspirators' portrayal of the Italian secretary as a foreign, corrupting force foreshadowed later waves of anti-immigrant hostility throughout European history. Their readiness to legitimize brutal action by invoking religious and national purity laid the groundwork for a recurring pattern of exclusionary rhetoric and political extremism. The lasting interest in Rizzio's story reveals our ongoing difficulty in grasping how seemingly ordinary individuals can become agents of horrific violence. His killers were not outlaws or mercenaries, but respected nobles and courtiers who genuinely believed they were safeguarding their realm from foreign subversion. Their descent from political adversaries into frenzied murderers offers a chilling reflection on how moral boundaries can collapse when group mentality and ideological fervor take hold. The infamous stains on the floor of Holyrood Palace remain more than a historical footnote or a source of eerie fascination. They symbolize how quickly political conflicts, when stoked by fear and self-interest, can spiral into gruesome bloodshed. These marks endure as stark evidence of the dangers that arise when ambition and intolerance overshadow principles of justice and restraint. David Rizzio's killing was far more than the fallout of a failed political maneuver. It was the tragically predictable result of a volatile mix of ambition, paranoia, and cultural division dynamics that still threaten societies today. The ferocity of his murder 50 wounds, inflicted by several assailants on a defenseless man, exposed something deeply unsettling about human nature. The moment the violence began, individual morality seemed to vanish, replaced by a mob-driven resolve that operated without conscience or compassion. The shift from composed political figures to frenzied killers is a chilling testament to how fragile the fabric of civilization can be when overwhelmed by intense emotion and the force of group dynamics. What's perhaps most disturbing is that the conspirators sincerely believed their actions were warranted, driven by religious conviction, patriotic fervor, and a sense of political urgency. They did not perceive themselves as criminals, but as defenders of the realm, confronting a foreign menace. This moral rationalization enabled them to carry out acts of shocking violence while preserving their belief in their own virtuous psychological loophole that has made countless atrocities throughout history possible. David Rizzio's assassination compels us to grapple with enduring truths about the abuse of power, the reach of prejudice, and the nature of violence, issues that remain hauntingly relevant even centuries later. In today's world, where deep political divides and cultural hostilities continue to intensify, the bloodied rooms of Holyrood Palace stand as a stark reminder that the descent from civility to savagery can happen more quickly than we like to admit. The real terror of that March evening in 1566 does not lie solely in the savagery of the act, but in the sobering realization that, given the right conditions, any one of us could be capable of inflicting or suffering similar violence.